Hey everybody, my name is Connor Cowan. I'm starting this YouTube channel called The Poetry Corner, where I'm going to go over just all kinds of different things related to poetry. I want to start doing a couple videos here and there where I'm talking about the basic structures and forms of poetry. How do we read poetry? Why is poetry important? How can I better learn to study poetry? Right, and this is something I've always wanted to get better at myself, and I just received my Bachelor's of Arts for English and Creative Writing from University of Central Florida, and I learned quite a lot about how to read better, how to write better. I explored all kinds of different wonderful themes in poetry, especially 20th century American poetry. I got to study some really interesting poetry from all over the world as well in a themes in poetry class, where we studied Irish poets like Seamus Heaney. We studied Nigerian poets like Christopher Okibo. And there's just so much to learn about the art of poems, about the art of communicating poetically. And I want to help anybody who's out there that wants to learn more take some of those first steps into being a better reader of poetry, and hopefully getting to enjoy it quite a lot as they begin to learn to read it more and more efficiently, like I have. So I'm going to try to start teaching a little bit using this little section of YouTube. So we'll see how it goes. So today's lesson, we're going to talk about these four things right here. We're going to talk about stanzas. We're going to talk about lines. We're going to talk about punctuation. Oh, I'm sorry, that's more than four things. That's why I did English, not math. There's five, sorry. So we're going to talk about stanzas, lines, punctuation, verse, and we're going to do a brief little thing on form. All right, and I'm going to talk to you about all of this by using this poem, which is one of my favorite poems by Robert Hayden. It's called Those Winter Sundays. And I'm going to use this as an example for talking about these items here, okay? So stanzas. When we're reading poetry, the first thing we need to understand is how it's structured, right? So poems are structured using stanzas. Stanzas are the equivalent of paragraphs in essays or novels. So if you look here for the poem, Those Winter Sundays, we have 3 paragraphs. Really, they're called stanzas because it's a poem, right? And we know that there's 3 of them because of the way that they're broken up. This is the beginning, and this is the end, and we know that because there's this space in between from the ending of this line to the beginning of this next section. So that's how you know a stanza has been made. There's blank space, or what we call white space as well, if it's on like a blank white page or a document online. It's called white space or blank space, and that's how you know where the beginnings and endings of stanzas are. Okay, so if we're studying a poem, poems are structured with stanzas. Now, a stanza can vary as far as what it looks like. So a typical paragraph, like in, I don't know, if you're writing an essay, will typically 5 sentences, right? 3 maybe on the low end, depending on how you use your punctuation to guide your words along. With poetry, stanzas, the paragraph forms for poems, stanzas can be broken up very differently. A whole stanza could just be one line. And the way you would know that is, again, if you had a single line of poetry written right here, on the other side of that, there'd be blank space here and blank space here, and then a body of text and a body of text, right? And that's how you would know it's a single stanza as a single line. Or even a stanza could be a single line and only one line. And that could be the entire poem. So you could have one line, it didn't even have to have punctuation in it, and that could be the first and last stanza and the only stanza in a poem, and it could be the entirety of a poem, minus the title, which can also be considered the first line as well, depending on how the poet wants the poem to be read. Along with that, you could have one giant block of text that never has a break in it, that never has any space, and that could also just be considered one stanza. As long as there isn't a break in the body of text to the next body of text, that is considered a whole stanza, the entire thing. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're reading poetry. So if we look here, there's 3 stanzas, and we know this because there's space here, and there's space here, and there's space down here as well, right? So 1, 2, 3. 3 stanzas total. So now let's go ahead and talk about lines. Stanzas, that makes sense, right? The lines within the stanzas are also very important. These are interesting. So, okay, again, to talk about a traditional paragraph with traditional punctuation, a line consists of a main clause, right, where you have a complete sentence. And that's how you would read through a paragraph. You know, you would read from sentence to sentence and taking breaths or short pauses where there's commas or semicolons or colons. And then you would take longer pauses at the end of a period, right? Because that's the end of one thought. Give yourself time to think about it. You read on to the next one. Similar things happening in poetry. But again, like the stanza, there's a lot of variability. There's a lot of room for experimenting and playing with structure, and that isn't to undermine structure, that's to help us take something that might be ordinary and see it in a new way, so that we can, and that's really what poetry does, right? And that happens on its simplest form at the line, at what the line is. Okay, this section right here from the beginning of the first line to the end of it, this is called a line break. All of these are line breaks. Line break, line break, line break, line break, line break into the next stanza, line break into the next stanza, right? Every single ending of a line is called a line break. Now, there's a variability with the kinds of line breaks that you can have. This, for example, is an enjambed line break. Sundays too, my father got up early. Pause. And put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. What happens here, right? Let's say we were to take this and put every line together. So if you took the and this rest of this line and put it up here, the way it would read would be like this. Sundays too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. But that's not the way it was intended to be read, right? So enjambment, what enjambment does, I'll read you the definition for enjambment more specifically. An enjambed line is when a line ending breaks right through a grammatical phrase. So I know this is kind of a stretch, right? You have your whole grammatical phrase. Well, your whole grammatical phrase kind of ends here at the comma, right? Because you would take a breath there naturally if you were following the standards for traditional punctuation. So as you read through this, you would, if you were to read it traditionally, with the rules in place, you would read from Sundays all the way to cold without stopping, without pausing. But because of the enjambed line right in the middle, you do pause here, and it causes a kind of, I like to call it a gasp. You kind of gasp right there for a second, you pause and hold, and then you begin right where you left off, and you continue with the full length of the thought. But that pause gives you a moment to really consider what the previous meaning of the line is that you just read. So that's kind of the way enjambment works. It causes you to stop right in the middle of something and then continue, because you're supposed to stop for a second and pause, right? So we read this. Sundays too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold, comma. Then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather made, banked fires blaze. no one ever thanked him. Right, so you see how that sounded. Now let's read it with just ignoring the enjambment, and we'll just read straight through. Sundays too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. Right, there's a difference in the way that your voice carries and the cadence and the rhythm. So there's rhythm that gets created in poetry because of enjambment. It causes you to fall up and down with your voice, with your thoughts too. You know, there's this rhythm to it that happens when you stop in the middle of something, consider the past, keep going, stop, go, stop, go. It's like being at red and green lights, right? Stop at the red light, continue, or they're more like speed bumps, maybe. They cause you to slow down. So that's enjambment. End stop is really interesting. So an end stop line is where the beginning of a line also has punctuation at the end of the line, indicating the end of a clause or a grammatical phrase. So here, this is a perfect example. The first line of the second stanza, I'd wake up and hear the cold splintering, breaking, period. Right, that's an end stop line. This causes the speaker to, or the reader, I'm sorry, to really see like the entirety of that line as its own segment. You're supposed to take into consideration the entirety of what has just been said. With the enjambment, you're following along and you're kind of moving with the rhythm of the way it's supposed to be spoken and read. But with end stop, it's more traditional. You read through the whole thing until the end, and then at the end of that, you consider what's just been said and you pause. Right? The definition of end stopped is this: an end stopped line is when a line ending and the ending of a grammatical phrase happen concurrently together. Right? So that's all that is, and the effect of an end stopped, like I said. You pause at the end of it, and it's an entire thought, right, in a poem. Similar to an entire sentence in a paragraph you might be reading in an essay. Now, punctuation is really interesting because punctuation can be used radically different in poetry, right? And there's some similarities between punctuation and the pauses that it creates and the line breaks. So, for example, these first two lines. Sundays too, my father got up early, enjambment, and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. But you notice here, so this is the thing about poetry. Poetry is visual just as much as it is oratory. There's no visual marker for the end of a thought, right? But that's kind of what's insinuated when you read it and you hear it. When you look at a comma, you're being indicated to visually in the poem to take a moment and pause. So there's a difference between pauses in the way that they're registered to us in a poem. So I might be listening and hear the enjambment and know to think and slow down, or I might see the comma and know to slow down and think and kind of reorient myself with what I had just read, right? So that's kind of the difference and the similarity really between enjambment, more like line breaks. Line breaks are a lot like commas. They're not like periods. Periods are definite, and I'll show you that here. So in this first stanza, at the end of the last line, we have this sore thumb really sticking out of the poem. Let's start with here. Third line. Third line. Then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather made banked fires blaze. Period. End. Stop. Linger. right? Then you have just this stark, cold statement. No one ever thanked him, period. This is supposed to stick out. This is supposed to be like, it almost has a kind of physical weight. It almost has a kind of physical weight to it as it sits at the end of the poem. It almost weighs down the entirety of the stanza. And that's because of the punctuation. You see a period here. You see a period here. When you see a period here, you know it's the end of whatever's just been said here. And you know it's the beginning of whatever's about to be said here. And then you come all the way to the end and you get hit with another period in the poem. And you're like, oh, wow. Okay, so this section's really important because there's this dual punctuation happening that's indicating to me visually that whatever has been put in between these two periods has weight, it's severe, and it's important to be read and understood. It's to the point as well. It's not necessarily poetic, but that's what makes the poem interesting, is that it's using something traditional in there with the grammar and punctuation to make a statement. Okay, so basically you've got commas and you've got periods. The commas are a lot like line breaks, where they cause that breath, that pause. However, a line break is more of a hearing comma, whereas a comma is a visual marker for pausing. So you have a pause here that you hear orally. You have a pause here that you see visually, right? Periods are definite markers of ending and beginning. And when they're used in poetry, they usually indicate that whatever is between them, whatever was before them, whatever comes after is important and needs to be heeded. It's the definite ending and beginning of something. And whatever's in between was important to consider and read. Okay. So that's punctuation. Verse, these two things are more housekeeping things just to kind of go over really quick. Maybe not pertaining to this particular poem, but I want to talk about verse. So you have blank verse and you have free verse. Okay. If any of you have heard of John Milton's Paradise Lost, that entire poem was written in unrhymed blank verse. So what that means is that it had a meter, it had rhythm to it, like a syllabic meter to it that was all the way through the same. And I'll find the definitions for you guys and I'll read them out loud so that you can hear what these definitions actually are. Because I don't know everything, but I have a lot of resources. So if I don't know something right off the top of my head, I'm not a professor yet. But what I do have are these great resources, and I'm going to read them to you so that you get the most clear, most profitable information. Okay, just so we're clear. Okay, blank verse, unrhymed iambic pentameter, unrhymed with 5 stress lines. So there's 5 syllables or 5 stresses in each line that would get written. The most widely used of English verse forms, having the closest rhythms to everyday English speech. So if you think about that, that would make it useful for memorization so that you could participate in the oratory culture. If we didn't have written language, if we could speak in rhythms, it's like remembering the music, the words in a song, the lyrics in a song. That's kind of the idea. And Shakespeare wrote, he wrote an iambic pentameter, for sure. And that was so that it was easy to memorize the lines. And as it was said, it's the most similar to everyday English speech. So all of that has a purpose. And again, it's frequently used by dramatists, right? So now you have free verse, right? Free verse is the contemporary choice. Contemporary being from the time that, I think, once the 70s were over up until now, that's when contemporary art, design, and writing began. Free verse is the contemporary choice. Free verse doesn't have any particular kind of structure. There's no necessity for rhyme. There's no necessity for rhythm or meter. You don't need to have any of that in there. Free verse. Verse having no regular meter, line length, or rhyme, depending instead for its shape on natural speech rhythms, the visual layout, and the counterpoint of stressed and unstressed syllables. Free verse must justify its reasons for its line breaks. And as you can see, we were justifying the reasons for the line breaks, right? So let's justify this reason here for the line break here where there's enjambment. Those winter Sundays is the title. So we know that the speaker is referring to a particular day of the week. Typically, we understand Sundays as being a day of rest. When you think about the Judeo-Christian Sabbath, so that's the day of rest. It's got religious implications. Then right here in the first line, it starts with Sundays too, my father got up early. So now we're referring to the Sundays already. And then there's this word too. What does that mean? Too, in this context, insinuates that there are other days that the father gets up early, right? There are other days. This is not the only day that he gets up. He gets up early. He doesn't sleep in. Typically on Sunday, you sleep in, you enjoy family, you go to church at maybe 10 a.m. But no, the father, Sundays too, my father got up early and jammed line and break. Gasp. And put his clothes on in the blue, black cold. You have this line right here that's just heavy with the meaning of what it's like to get up on the Sabbath day, to suffer and, to not rest, to not sleep in, to get up and put his clothes on in the blue, black cold. That visual imagery of the blue and the black air outside that's just crushing and dense and frigid, and he would get up and put his clothes on. He would be the one to brace the cold every morning before everybody did, and he did that every day, even on those winter Sundays. So when you think about free verse and the reasons why, and like a line break has to prove itself to the reader for its existence, why the poet has to prove why that matters, we can see why it matters because it creates this sense of drama for the reader, right? We have that ending and we consider, Sundays too, my father got up early. Great, cool. And then you get hit with this longer line, this heavier line of meaning. That's why the enjambment's there. Because if you read it all in one sitting, there wouldn't be this drama of anticipation to get to this line, which is what you need in the poem. Okay? Form. There's two forms. There's closed form and there's open form. I'll read these definitions to you as well. So closed form is a term for poems that conform to the specifications of an abstract model or predictable pattern. And then on the other hand, open form is a term for poems that do not conform to an abstract model or predictable pattern. So a closed form might be something like iambic pentameter. That's a closed form of poetry with a specific abstract pattern. Open form wouldn't conform to any particular abstract form or pattern. So if we look here, we have some instances of closed form where, there's 5 lines here, 4 lines here, 5 lines here, and it creates a kind of symmetry, where you have like the middle, there's a trinity, there's these different like forms that are happening, patterns maybe that you can pick up, but there's nothing specifically in here that, like, there's no rhyming couplets, nothing at the end rhymes. You have internal rhyme that's happening with things like ached, made, ached, made. There's that similarity in sound in the middle of the word, the beginning of the words. Banked, where else? Thanked. Those words rhyme, but they're not in a pattern. They just rhyme, and they create rhythm and sound and whatnot. So we've gone over stanzas, we've gone over lines, there's enjambed lines, there's end stop lines. We've gone over punctuation, the uses of comma and period, how comma is a lot like a visual representation of a line break. Periods being indicators of importance for meaning in whenever they're used in a line. Verse, we talked about blank verse and we talked about free verse. This is a free verse poem, obviously. Then we talked about the different types of forms. We have a closed form, which adheres to a particular kind of pattern and meter. And then open form, which doesn't necessarily conform to those things specifically as they've been written. So it's like Milton definitely used a closed form in his poem Paradise Lost because he knowingly used iambic pentameter and whatnot. But here, Haydn didn't specifically use anything, so it's open form, it's free verse. So yeah, that's the end of my first video. We went over those 5 things. In the next video, I'll cover another group of, so this was kind of like a structural video. We might talk about imagery in the next one, diction, sound, maybe a little bit more, and I'll use a different poem for a different example. Might bring up some other things as well. But yeah, thank you for watching. I hope this was helpful. Look at the caption below and to get more information. I'll probably put a link to helpful resources. My Instagram should be on here somewhere. You can find it on my page, or I'll put that link in my caption as well. But thank you. I hope this was helpful. And if you have any questions, just reach out. I'll put my email in there as well. Thank you.